You're a good debater and you're not afraid of a fight. So why have your comments off? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've turned them on for a lot of things.
On your shorts you do.
Right. In some of my lives, I think they're on, but almost as soon as I turn them on, there's photos of my family's homes,
okay.
What's the address, and at what point, and I just want to clarify,
please.
I don't have to take that abuse.
Agreed.
Like, I don't come to work and slap the dick out of their mouth.
Kind of why do you have a disdain for informants, in your opinion?
I don't disdain them. I downright fucking hate them. Okay. That's okay. But see, this is why I can say it. That Jeff's crazy. He's on medication. I have a disdain for them because no man should ever go to prison, on the words of another man, number one. Number two, in 90% of the cases you look at, the informant has done more vile and disturbing crap than those that are being accused. Number three, I find it oxymoronic when a man, Joey Merlino, because everybody knows who he is, he goes in front of a judge, they can bring up everything he's ever been accused of, including murders and whatever else. Even though he's acquitted, it doesn't really matter because it's a character judgment. But yet in that same case, you can't turn that around and say, well, let's judge the rat. Judges don't allow that. So for me, it's like you're walking in, you're already behind.
I'm going to tell you something. If you don't ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them attention. I can't. There's good friends of mine out on the say. Well, he's divorced, you have to do it tough. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the one. I should know that the boss is your boss.
Please be advised the following content contains themes and subject matter that may be unsettling, intense, or unsuitable for some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
So when we met last time, we discussed Paul Castellano and everything that he was doing since the 1940s. Based on a lot of emails that I got, a lot of people were very surprised at just how proficient Castellano was. The one thing nobody asked me, and it surprised me a bit, is where was all his criminal shit? And the criminal shit is the financial shit. In his entire file, there is nothing. I mean, nothing surreptitious other than financial stuff until you get to like the 1980s, obviously. And so you might ask, what does that mean? And it means that despite what we have believed about Castellano for a long time now, he was smart and was low key. The only pinch he ever had was in his youth up until, obviously, his indictment. And I think the other interesting facet here is that Castellano on his own was a juggernaut, and he was not dependent on Carlo Gambino ascending the throne. And in fact, it likely and probably made much more sense now as to why Carlo chose Paul to run the family instead of Neil Delacroce. And it's not knocking Neil Delacroce at all, but he was a street gangster, and a family under Carlo became a financial crime family, and Paul just continued down that line. And it gets exacerbated because Paul focused on the bottom line, and street guys coming up felt like Paul should be different. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen. John Gotti was afraid of Paul Castellano, as was everyone else. Also, I think the other thing I find intriguing is that Carlo was barely tailed in those days, but the FBI was on to Paul from day one and got nothing close for 40 fucking years. And to me, that's just another accolade of Paul keeping himself scarce and not giving the feds anything. They could suspect whatever the fuck they wanted, but proving it was altogether a different issue. So on May 15th, 1964, the FBI received a tip that Paul Castellano had purchased Royal Laundry. The name is redacted, so I can't tell you specifically for 100% who it is, but I believe it was Anthony Scotto. And I say that because in those days, Scotto was running the docks and was in control of the AFL-CIO. So I do believe it was Anthony Scotto, but according to the paperwork, Paul and Anthony Scotto purchased Royal Laundry together. According to an informant, Castellano bought into Royal with Scotto because of Scotto's contacts and strength within the labor unions, and that he knew that Scotto could push contracts their way without interference. On May 5th of 64, an informant known as T3 comes forward to explain that Castellano was the owner of Blue Ribbon Ice Cream and Judy Ann Ice Cream and was directly competing with Marshani Ice Cream. Marshani Ice Cream filed a complaint that Blue Ribbon and Judy Ann were stealing ice cream equipment and using the machines improperly. Don't ask me what the fuck that means because I have no idea. Maybe he was making fucking sausage out of human parts. Who knows? While the complaint was filed in Kings County, Brooklyn, it shows that the district attorney buried that information. The FBI would then continue to surveil Paul and would learn that he owned even more businesses than anybody thought. And you guys know, we've talked about over 250 companies already. And here are some more. Luby Leasing Corporation, Gotham Auto Lease, Empire Lincoln Mercury, General Rendering Company were all companies that Paul owned and had people running. What is interesting is the Los Angeles Police Department opened an intelligence report on Paul Castellano in 1964, and there aren't really any details that I could give you because there isn't a reason for them to even open a file other than to say that the file talks about the NYPD sending information back to Los Angeles involving Paul Castellano. In June 23rd of 64, the FBI was building an anti-racketeering case against Paul, or at least attempting to do so. They would have more informants come forward, former employees, and they would find out that Royal Laundry, which was expanding all over New York City, was controlled by Castellano and Anthony Scotto. They were also buying up Royal Hand Laundry and converting it to Royal Laundry. In September of 1964, the FBI questioned Tommy Masato's wife about his relationship with Paul and Carlo. She explained that yes, they were all related, but she could not provide any proof as to how they were related. The FBI found records that Masato and Castellano and Gambino owned a lot of real estate in San Juan, Puerto Rico, specifically high-end hotels, and were the de facto owners of the La Concha Hotel in San Juan. In April of that year, the FBI gets intel that Castellano now owns C&S Meats, which had 10 establishments in New York City. The FBI called Castellano and he admitted to owning them, but explained that they had gone out of business and the deed was transferred to Gambino and himself, and he just simply took them over. He also would explain through his attorney in records showing that the stores were in fact previously owned by Bartolo Castellano and Carlo Gambino, and once Paul overtook the businesses, he leased out the locations to Paul Gambino. The FBI didn't believe Paul, but in this case, he was fully truthful and showed the right documentation through his attorneys. Let's see. The last will and testament of Bartolo was produced and handed over, and in the will, Bartolo explained that upon his death, Paul Gambino was to be offered to buy the property. Castellano's attorneys then submitted a check for the sale of the property for $25,000 to Paul Gambino. So Gambino was just simply, Castellano was simply covering all of his bases. On August 12th of 1964, a dentist who was very close to Paul Castellano and Carlo comes forward and offers up what he knew about them. And what is odd is the FBI was very specific in this file that Nelson LaCalci came forward on his own without any sort of prodding. Now, we've seen this before. A guy just comes forward to come forward. And I never really buy that because in those days and even today, the FBI will apply pressure at your businesses and, your church just to get you to come forward. It's really a lot of harassment more than anything. This guy was nothing but a fucking crumb. Even if the information he provided was a bit laughable, it's just the fact that he obviously had some sort of axe to grind. After all, you will see this guy had stomach cancer, and Paul and Carlo paid his hospital bills and came to see him for the month that he was in Beth Israel undergoing treatment for stomach cancer. He tells Special Agent John Higgins that he was born in Tampa, Florida in 1910. He arrived in New York City in 1928 to attend NYU. He opens his own office in Manhattan and now operates his dental clinic for Local 27 of the Teamsters Union. He was asked when the last time he saw Paul Castellano, and he explained that he saw him back in March. He explains that Paul came to see him at Beth Israel Hospital, where he was undergoing cancer treatments, and was surprised to see him because they had had a falling out years back. LaCalci admits that he was a gambler and hadn't paid bookies back, and that caused a rift between him and Paul Castellano, as Castellano simply just cut him off. He explained that Castellano came to see him twice in the hospital. He thought Castellano likely found out about his hospitalization through the grapevine. When asked about Carlo Gambino, He explained that he treated Gambino several times and had been a house guest of Gambino and vice versa. He admitted to knowing Paul Gambino, but said he hadn't seen Gambino since the issue with Paul and that the gambling debts had still not been settled out. He admitted knowing Tommy Greco, Charlie Dongara, and Joe Biondo, simply stating that they were patients of his. Upon further investigation, the FBI would find out that not once were any of these men written down as patients of Lee Calcy. And in fact, Paul Castellano's bail sheet many years back over that theft that we talked about, Calcy is the one who put up the surety bond for Castellano. He would explain that he would always remove documents regarding patients that were his friends. He said that it was through Paul and Carlo that he became associated with Local 27. He claimed, or attempted to claim, being naive. What these men did, he wasn't sure. When prodded, Calcy acted shocked when it was explained to him that these men were all hoodlums in New York City. So as you can see, he tells small truths, half-truths. The problem is, some of you may say, well, he's not giving up shit, but he really is in all actuality. You have to deny knowing these people. You don't offer the FBI shit ever, never, ever. Calcy's certified public accountant was the same CPA that Gambino and Castellano used. When shown a photo of Paul and Carlo, he identifies them without a problem. The FBI then goes back to the hotel in San Juan, and what they would find was Castellano's name and number written down on a ledger. Not just that he had stayed there, but his name was at the top of a list of ownership. And when the FBI looked into the paper trail of Castellano, like outgoing calls made when he was in Puerto Rico, they were all destroyed by a hotel management. The FBI would probe the hotel staff, who all claimed not to know who Paul was and that they had never seen him before. However, the FBI found hotel registration cards and a box of documents with his signature and the name at the bottom, paying for laundry services to the hotel for all new linens and more. In December of '64, a complaint gets made in New York City by the Porco Pork Company against Castellano through his P&H rendering company. According to the report, Castellano attempted to purchase the company and Porco Pork refused to sell. A few days later, after the initial offer, which was twice the worth of the company, 3 men showed up and explained to the owner of Porco Pork that he might have an accident. It would be better for him to sell than to not sell. So when the FBI and law enforcement found out about this complaint, they went directly to the owner of Porco Pork Company, which was located in Jamaica, Queens, and he denied knowing Castellano or P&H Rendering, and said nobody had ever come into his store attempting to push him out of business or threats of force. Then another informant comes forward not long after that report and explained that Castellano was a juggernaut and controlled everything within the city, and that smaller companies were worried about threats from Castellano. However, none of them verified if Castellano had ever made a solid threat. It was inferred more than spoken. This informant explained that Castellano now controlled Conti supermarkets and had for 15 years. He also explained that Castellano had a business contract, Trun's Meat Company, who was supplying fat to Castellano's own companies at a reduced rate. And all it really meant was that Castellano was controlling everything, and I mean everything. And it just goes to show you how confused informants were and how confused the FBI was. And there was an incident in 1965 that probably showcases this better than anything. The feds were still out trying to prove that Castellano controlled everything, and an informant would come forward and explain that Castellano owned Amalgamated Meats and that it had the backing of the Meat Cutters Union Local 474. The informant, which we know was in that union, explained to the feds that the union dealt mainly with retail butchers in New York City and some upstate. He explained that he never met Paul or any of the Castellanos, but heard they were in the Mafia. He further told the FBI that he could get somebody closer to the top of the union to talk to them, which he did. And this informant? Well, you'll see what I mean. Some 3 months later, a new informant from the union sat down with special agents and explained to the FBI that the Van Inderstein Company, which was a rendering firm, seemed to be losing contracts to the P&H Rendering Company nonstop. We know P&H is owned by Paul. We also know that Van Inderstein is also owned by Paul. And what Paul is doing here is insanely bright. He owned both, competed against himself, forcing one of his own companies to lose contract to another one of his own companies. And as we see here, the informant gets all goofy with it. The FBI gets all goofy with it. And what Paul has done is throw a tornado in the middle. He makes it appear as if he's bullying a company, which some might say, well, you're giving yourself too much attention. That's not a good thing. But it worked to his benefit because it confused the FBI, it confused informants as to who the actual owner was. And considering that Paul owned both, he had documentation to support both. So either way, the trail of breadcrumbs were totally eaten up. And it just sent informants in the FBI spinning their tires and walking around in circles looking fucking nuts. And it's almost funny to see how he did it. And to further showcase just how smart Paul was, listen to this. So in 1965, Michael Tyrone, who was 65, owned and operated the Meniere's Meat Market located in Babylon, New York. He tells the FBI that he ran his own butcher shop for 3 years and that his mortgage was owned by Long Island Fat Company. He explained that other companies he tried to sell fat to undercut him severely. He was struggling, and the P&H company had called him, offering to buy him out. He thought about it, but didn't. A little time later, he suffered a bad leg fracture and was forced to close his business. Then he goes to work for General Rendering Company. And so what is funny about that? Well, what's funny about that is the lending company or the mortgage company, the Long Island Fat Company, was owned by Paul Castellano. P&H was owned by Paul Castellano. General Rendering was owned by Paul Castellano, but run by Thomas Masato. What Paul did was offer to buy the guy out, and he's basically doubling up. The poor bastard goes tips up, and Paul Castellano reclaims the property, which he goes out and rents, basically tripling what he was getting, and then he brings the guy in to work for him for peanuts. Paul is utterly and completely controlling the bottom line. And that's what I've tried to make clear in talking about Paul, is that he controls every facet of this. And you're going to be very hard pressed to find another fucking guy in the history of organized crime, let's be honest, that had every fucking box checked. I mean, every fucking box. And so the reality is, and I didn't mean to rush through this part of the show, but there was a lot of information I had to get through because next week there's going to be more, and we're going to start to deviate a little bit next week. I'm going to stop talking about so much of this business stuff and start to move towards more of the criminal stuff. But the reality is that when you're involved in organized crime, money is always the bottom line. It's the one common denominator everybody wants. And you guys have been listening to me, some of you, for a decade. Have we ever discussed someone in organized crime that was really this prolific at business? You know, it's one thing. You own 3 or 4 places. You take your kickback from it. But with Paul, it was just everything. Everything. And I think now we can see post-1930s, or maybe even 40s, why people might have had a problem with Paul. But people forget Paul paid his fucking dues. He did what he had to do. And it was about business. It was about making money. And everything that we've talked about was illegal. It's not like he was, that's the point I want to get across. Because it's not like he was extorting financial crimes, loan sharking. He was doing all of that stuff. But because he's out not pulling a trigger every 3 days, people think he's soft. And he's not. He's not. At the end of the day, this is all about money and power, right? Guys need to have power. Guys need to have money. And I've often said this about Pablo Escobar. How much is enough? How much do you really need? This guy was burning money in his house because he had too much and didn't know what to do with it. Rats were eating his money. It was the power. It was the power. He valued power more than he valued money. And if he had just valued money instead, he could have walked away and nobody would have ever said a fucking word to the guy again. But it's that power. It's the power that leads to the demise of bosses. And we've talked about it a million times on this show. And so when we come back next week, we're going to talk, I think we're maybe going to do maybe one more week of Castellano. I'm going to condense the last 200, 300 pages I have. But it's more of a lesson in money. It's a lesson in money. And I'm sure a lot of that sort of stuff still goes on today. But that's how Paul was able to earn his stature in organized crime. And because it's not riddled with big headlines that Paul blows this one's head off, Paul cuts this guy's prick off and puts it in his mouth, doesn't make Paul any less feared. Because truly, the motherfucker you should fear in life is the one that doesn't have to make a threat. It's perceived. And that's the way organized crime is. All right, we're going to see everybody right here next week, same time, same bat channel. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into the last week of Paul Castellano. And it's been an interesting sort of narrative. I think we've learned, a lot of things. And it's my hope that you got something out of this and you learned a lot more about Paul Castellano than you knew before. And it still sort of vexes me why more people, don't invest in paperwork because, as you guys can see and hear, obviously, it's given us, 6, 7, 8 shows now. And there always seems to be this complaint on YouTube from people that, that don't even cover the Mafia, who say stuff like, oh, they always talk about the same shit. And I cannot disagree more. We don't talk about the same stuff. And this is why I hope you keep coming back for these deep dives. And I think looking back at what we have covered thus far, Paul, earned every stripe he ever achieved, and likely because he ran the streets for Carlo beginning in the late 1960s is why he took over, and it's that natural succession. I do think there could still be an argument made that perhaps he forgot what it took to get there in the end, and his greed is what truly created chaos for him. And I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. And if any mistake that Paul made in the end is forgetting what he needed to do to insulate himself. And the two biggest mistakes that Paul made was in the form of the Westies and Roy DeMeo. And those were his true downfalls. And I say that because, yes, he was indicted for this stuff before the commission trial. And we're never going to know exactly how much they had on Paul Castellano in that case. But not much ever came out about any of that other than, Tony Dux's mouth. And if Tony Dux doesn't bellyache about Paul in his car, Paul might not ever be indicted. Or at least there wouldn't be enough information publicly out on the streets. But either way, we know how it ended, don't we? On June 8th of 1967, an informant comes forward and would tell the FBI that a friend of his who was a connected guy had lost his union job, and that messages were sent to Paul Castellano and that his friend was refused any help. He also explained that he knew that his friend had frequently tried to get Paul's supermarket chains to have their knives sharpened by his union, but Castellano refused because the very union his friend was suggesting was actually controlled by Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, and they were infuriated by anyone within that union trying to sell their own union to them. And that was likely why Castellano refused to allow his friend back into that union. This is just another example of Castellano controlling every single facet of the business. I mean, you're going to be hard-pressed to find anybody else who utterly controlled an entire business like that, with few exceptions like construction and cement a few decades later, by the entire Mafia. But even in those early days, you can see just how proficient Paul was and how thorough he was. November 22nd of 1967, another informant came forward and explained that Paul was now in control of Golden Packing Company located off 12th Street. This informant stated to the FBI that Paul would own these companies for a few years, then move relatives in to run it, and would falsify records for a sale to remove himself from ownership. The FBI then begins to follow around Castellano, and he was maintaining his usual sort of routine, businesses in Brooklyn. They did follow him to a restaurant in 1967 at Marbona Restaurant off Grand Street, which is a couple blocks away from me. Those in attendance at this restaurant were Carlo Gambino, Joe N. Gallo, Paul Castellano, Neil Delacroce, and Paul Gambino. In July of 1967, the FBI surveilled the wake and funeral of Tommy Lucchese, and those in attendance were numerous, but the FBI noted Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, Tony Salerno, Neil Delacroce, Joe N'Gallo, who all sat together at the funeral. The FBI got a tip from another informant that the Gambinos controlled a very lucrative bookmaking operation in the Miami area, and the informant provided the telephone number to Alfie's News, 305-531-9183. The name of the bookmaker is redacted in the reports, but according to the FBI and the informant, the bookmaker in charge of Alfie's News was running an interstate gambling wire. And then oddly, in June of 1967, Alfie's News gets bombed, and the FBI believed it was in retaliation against the bookmaker by none other than Santo Trafficante. And so what I did was, when I came across this, I began to cross-reference the incident in 1967. And 1967 down in Florida was a batshit crazy year in Miami alone. There were 8 bombings between May and August of that year, and I have the list of the places they got bombed. It's very interesting, because I had never heard of this before. August 21st, John Clarence Cook and family escape when 2 bombs explode in front of 1240 Northeast 82nd Street. July 13th, bomb in auto of William Shantz of North Miami Beach fails to detonate. Police believe it was a case of mistaken identity. Yeah, okay, because how many times have you seen that? July 12th, Miami officer Gerald Sosslaw and family unhurt when dynamite explosion rips through the front yard. June 16th, Alfie's Mart, an all-night newsstand and bookie hangout in Miami Beach off Alton Road, is shattered by a bomb planted in a telephone booth. June 3rd, unoccupied auto belonging to the wife of bookie Mickey Zion of North Bay Village was bombed. June 1st, Epicure Market next door to Alfie's gets bombed. Police believe it was intended for the newsstand. June 1st, gambler Chappie Rand's cleaning store on Motel Row hit by 2 phosphorus grenades. May 30th, bomb tossed on gambler Mickey Zion's bedroom balcony fails to explode. Jewel financier John Clarence Cook, who complained too many cops were tailing him, survived a pre-dawn bombing raid attack Monday and may welcome back the watchful eye of the law. Two-time bombs ripped apart a carport while Cook, 37, and his wife and 4 children slept inside their $40,000 home off 1240 Northeast 82nd Street. The explosion shattered Cook's car and a sleek red high-powered speedboat, but all members of the family emerged unhurt from the rubble and shattered glass that sprayed the interior of the house and lawn. The attack is the latest in a series of terror tactics to rip up Miami's underworld, was considered daring since Cook's movements have been watched almost constantly for the past few years by local and federal law enforcement. Cook's anger at being tailed reached a high point in early 1965, shortly after the arrest of his buddies, Beach Boys Jack Murphy the Surf Murphy and Dale Allen Coon for slipping the fabled Star of India sapphire out of New York Museum. Cook rammed an FBI agent's car to make his point and got 85 days in jail, one of the few times he's had to cool his heels behind bars. To add intrigue to Monday's attack, Cook himself is under investigation in the July 12th dynamite explosion at a Miami police officer Gerald E. Soslaw's home. A week after the Soslaw bombing, Cook's good friend and fellow diamond collector Herman High Gordon, a mysterious go-between in the Star of India recovery, was shot behind the ears 5 blocks from Cook's home. Another Cook pal, gambler Frank Lefty Rosenthal, was summoned before the Dade grand jury after a rash of early summer bombings in Miami Beach bookie establishments. An FBI agent once remarked that whenever they wanted to check up on big-time gangsters visiting Miami, all they had to do was check Cook's house. 9 times out of 10, they all show up there. It's a regular underworld convention hall, the agent would say. Hot-tempered Cook, who's been arrested several times on 2 different continents on suspicion of jewel thefts but never convicted, seemed more upset about the presence of newsmen on his property than the shambles created by the bombs. He ordered the press off his property. His sky blue new Cadillac was wrecked, and it looked like someone had used a can operator on his Donzi speedboat to pry the deck from the hull. Two white doors were blown off the house, and every window in sight caved in. Cook's $12,000 24-foot cruiser, named after his 101-pound former Playboy bunny wife, Marianne, was safely moored in the canal behind the house. The explosions rocked the neighborhood about 3:45 in the morning and broke windows 2 houses away. Interestingly, Cook's house is the only one on the block that does not have a for sale sign decorating the front yard. So it appears there was some sort of mob war going on down in Miami. In December of '67, an intel report based out of Washington, D.C. claimed that while Paul Castellano is believed to be running the day-to-day operations of the Gambino crime family, Paul is only being seen with 2 people. Those 2 people would be Carlo Gambino and Neil Della Croce. The notation on the report says that Castellano appears to have given up criminality and is purely focused on his legitimate businesses. So in 1968, a report hits the FBI, and here are the details. Paul received a telephone call while at work from his wife shortly after 10 a.m. on April 22nd of 1968. His wife was seemingly on the verge of hysteria and talked about men having been in the house and a man with a gun. He immediately left his businesses in Brooklyn and went home. When he arrived at his home, the police department had already appeared on the scene. He believed that 3 men representing themselves as FBI agents were in reality thieves, and from the description given by the wife, he was stated that he was unable to identify any of the 3 men. He stated that he generally kept $2,000 in his house. He was questioned on whether or not a gangland war was on the horizon and as to whether or not the Bonanno crime family might be responsible. He claimed he didn't know who Joe Bonanno was and only knew of him due to news reports. He then was asked if there was a war brewing within the Gambino crime family, and he stated that Carlo was his brother-in-law and cousin and that they were on the best of terms, that he knew nothing about anything called the Gambino crime family. Then in January of '68, Paul's company, P&H, goes tits up. And it's through informants that he relayed to the FBI that Paul was trying to sell the plant and had no takers. So through his friendships with the president of the city council, a man with the last name O'Connor, that the plant was found to violate the health code. And what's interesting is Paul had insurance for such events, and while losing the plant looked like a financial disaster for him, his insurance covered the loss. So Paul used his friends in city council to get him to the end goal. And it's after this that the FBI launches a huge investigation into all of Paul's businesses on the financial ends, and they end up going back a decade. It could not find a single crime attached to any of the finances of any of the companies at all. All right, here's a direct quote. When the Castellanos and Gambinos couldn't pay you off, they'd bust you out or bend you to your fucking knees, an informant would tell the FBI. And a report dated of March of 1968. This is where the range of scope of the Gambino and Castellano power shows its true force and shows just how much they control the market. Many companies who tried to compete just got buried in a hurry because nobody could take on Paul or Carlo, but many of the companies where competition had actually borrowed money from Paul to open up. So in essence, there was no competition. A certain importing company whose name is redacted explained to the FBI that he had never borrowed from Paul or Carlo Gambino ever and didn't have any direct knowledge of hoodlums being involved in the marketplace. He did say, however, that one of his biggest competitors was known as Douglas Sales in New Jersey, and Douglas Sales had spread the word that Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano had financed their operations and that this company was a front for the mob. Even though he made the allegation, he said he never bothered to do anything about it out of fear. When they pressed him, he stated that the Douglas company was controlled by Local 15 of the Industrial Maintenance Employees Union in Babylon, New York. This union, according to the man, was fully controlled by Carlo Gambino. He continued to explain that the Ranchers Packing Company in New Hyde Park was a fully controlled operation by the Gambino crime family. He explained that he knows someone who invested his life savings into his meat packing company before merging with Ranchers. He would then provide the name to the FBI and they would conduct an interview. The owner of this redacted company explained that he invested his life savings into establishing a meat packing company. He also borrowed substantial money from a bank to open up his business. He explained that he and his wife and his children worked all day and night, 7 days a week at that plant. While business was slow, the bills began to mount, and creditors began to come after them. And it was a bad time for his family. One day, out of the blue, Paul Castellano and Paul Gambino show up at his home. Paul Castellano and Paul Gambino would explain to the owner that they knew the right people in the city and they knew the right city council members and they could get extensions of credit for them, and the city council would step in and slow the creditors and back them off. Castellano explained that they owned a judge and they could actually help. All Castellano wanted in return for his $50,000 to $70,000 investment was 5 to 10% of stock in that company. The man refused, and eventually the owner had problems with the courts and more, and eventually he loses everything. And here is what's interesting. In surveillance reports, it would show Carlo and Paul together. Now, I want you guys to pay attention to this because this is something that I found completely fucking intriguing, and it just shows how Carlo and Paul were and what Paul ended up sort of being. In surveillance reports, it would show that Carlo and Paul would be together, and it seems like every single detail in 100 different reports is the same. Paul and Carlo would pull up to some location, meet with a third person for 2 minutes, and they would leave. And this happened some 4 dozen times. They simply showed up, met a third party, 2-minute conversation, and boom, gone. In one case, Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, and Neil Della Croce were together at a restaurant sitting outside. A man pulled up in a car, sat down for 2 minutes, had a discussion, got up and left. And it's like this over and over and over in these 4 dozen surveillance reports. And think about that. They limited the conversation to getting right to the fucking point because they knew they were being watched. In November of 1968, another informant comes forward and explains that Paul had taken over the Gambino family's day-to-day operations and that Paul is now trying to control the hot dog vending business in the city. According to the informant, he states that Paul is trying to muscle in and create a monopoly on the hot dog cart vending services in the entire city. In 1968, a report is made that Castellano is controlling once again the Gambinos in day-to-day operations and that Castellano maintains an office on Avenue J and East 42nd Street in Brooklyn. He holds court in an office above his butcher shop. An informant would verify this and would also explain that Paul is trying to build a nightclub through Carmine Lombardozzi in Brooklyn, located behind Hickory Q Pancake House in Brooklyn of Emmons Avenue. Further in 68, a bunch of other meatpacking and distribution owners come forward to the FBI and tell the FBI the same story over and over and over again, that they had bought a company, poured their life savings into it, but were slowly gouged by the competitors and that nobody could compete against Castellano or Gambino, and not that they had done anything illegal, but they just controlled everything in the market, and their way of control was just by doing business to the point where their business suffered because they could not compete on any level. And that's when Castellano and Gambino would enter the fray and offer a loan. So they would directly compete, and they knew that they could control the marketplace. So a guy, when he started to lose money, doesn't really have anywhere to turn. And the only place he wants to turn to if he doesn't want to go tits up is to get a loan through Gambino or Castellano. When they refused a loan, they ended up just going out of business. Several of these owners explained that those who took loans typically didn't have to pay back any of the money, but often would have to give up 10% to 15% of their net gross, sort of as a franchise fee or a stock option. And it was the legal way for Castellano to bust them out. Each owner would tell the FBI the same thing, and that they were not bullied, they were never threatened or anything else. They just got into a market that was fully saturated and fully controlled by Castellano and Gambino. And while Gambino and Castellano did try to help them out financially, many of them were just too afraid of them and would rather try on their own to right the ship rather than owe them money or to give them 10% royalty fees. In October of 1968, another informant steps forward and tells the FBI that Paul has begun inroads into controlling the hot dog business into the city. The informant explained that how Paul is beginning to achieve this is by supplying all of the vendors with his hot dogs. So in other words, no vendor can get a fucking hot dog unless it's from Paul's meat company. The informant explained that this is Paul's first step in controlling the industry. Paul's second step, according to the informant, was that Paul was going to control the actual carts themselves. You could only get a cart through Paul. So it would become all carts, hot dogs, and buns came through Paul. And Paul would use a cousin's bakery in Brooklyn for the bread. So once again, it just shows you the magnitude of what Paul was able to do. So we're going to move to 1970, specifically 2/24/1970. A report is made that Paul is no longer in the fat rendering business and that he has taken or absorbed the crew of Vincent Carraro, who was busted down to soldier. According to an FBI report, Paul Castellano was one of 2 underbosses in the Gambino crime family, and that the membership of the family is said to be 1,000 members and more. In June of 1970, Castellano was seen with Carlo Gambino meeting with Joe Colombo. Informants explained to the FBI that Gambino and Castellano were not happy with Colombo's activities and had been attempting to get Colombo to stand down. There would be a meeting on June 2nd and 3rd at a restaurant off 86th Street between Joe Colombo, Neil Della Croce, and Carlo Gambino. According to the informant, Gambino demanded that Colombo stop his picketing of the FBI office activities immediately. In July of 1970, a commission meeting was set. At this meeting was Paul Castellano, Neil Della Croce, and others in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Now, this really wasn't a commission meeting. This was a big sit-down. I should have just said it was a sit-down. But it took place in Bridgeport, Connecticut in July of 1970. And the issue at hand was a beef between David Accavetti and Frank Piccolo. No further information was ascertained by the FBI, but as we all know, Piccolo would get hit in 1981 on orders of Paul Castellano because he was encroaching into Genovese turf in Connecticut. So that's just for reference. Piccolo had been a thorn in Castellano's ass for a long time. And that's, pretty much where we're going to leave it. We have to leave it there because we literally just went through 800 pages of FBI reports. Those are the only pages ever to be released publicly on Paul Castellano. And if you think about it, I did overstep 150 pages, which contained just more financial shit. In 800 pages, here's the one thing we never saw. We never saw no crimes. And when I say that, I mean not the glowing, obvious crimes you might expect to see. And Paul, for all he was smarter than most people. I mean, Christ, look at just the meetings between Carlo and him and a third party. 2 minutes, boom, and gone. They were very self-aware and very conscious of surveillance and more. And when you think about it, and I don't mean I'm not trying to disparage John Gotti, but do you see now why so many loathed Gotti on the streets? There is a part of the streets that love John Gotti for his "this is who I am" sort of stance. But the hardlined, the old world guys didn't get it. And to show the evolution of that, look at Joey Merlino. He's John Gotti 2.0. But Gotti was a fucking gangster, and Joey is nothing more than a weasel who ordered his friends around. That's the way it's always been. Joey didn't have an ounce of the intelligence that he should have had. And what Joey had was balls. But Joey had balls as long as somebody else is pulling the trigger. And Joey's existence outside of Philadelphia is shit. And so what will you look back on when it comes to Paul? His intelligence for business, his moxie for business. And while most of what we have discussed was very much about the business side of things and not mayhem, trust me when I tell you, Paul was a violent fucking guy. He didn't fuck around 1 ounce. He didn't hesitate to order the death of anybody. An old timer told me just recently, and I've said this before, but he looked at me and he says, they say John Gotti killed 100 guys, and if John Gotti killed 100 guys, Big Paul killed 1,000. Paul used murder as an extension for a penalty in silence. He just wouldn't behead a guy over small shit. He seemed to have patience until a certain point. And then once it began to get too much, and the gavel came, and it came hard and fast. Look at his daughter Connie, her husband. He was abusing her. Paul didn't hesitate. He had the guy tortured and chopped the fuck up. And from what I understand, and I got to be careful about how I say this, Paul was there in person to give the guy his dose of medicine. And he didn't force others to do it. And that says a lot about Paul. He could have pushed a button till the cows came home, but he didn't in that situation. He would handle shit himself if he needed to. And yes, Paul had Roy DeMeo bring Frank Amato to a location. And from what I understand, Paul tortured the fucking guy and had no issue doing it. DeMeo would have Amato dumped at sea. But from what I understand, Paul personally handled it himself. And Amato didn't go easy, according to reports and according to what informants told the FBI. It was a brutal murder, and rightfully so. But that's the distortion I always talk about when it comes to YouTube. These guys all say, well, Roy DeMeo, got Frank D'Amato, shot him in the head, and that was it. Oh, that was not it. That was not how it went down. And so historians are going to look back on Paul however they want. But the one thing you can't take away from Paul is the pure gangster and racketeer that he was. He was a gangster who formed into a massive racketeer. And while in his late age, he made some mistakes, it just shows you that the streets and nothing in life is perfect. Nobody is perfect. The mere fact that Paul established roots back in Sicily in the 1970s says a lot. And so maybe what Frank Cali, what he establishes that 20 years later, this was actually truly started by Paul. What do you guys think? What do you think about this series? Did you learn something? Did it change your thoughts on Paul? It doesn't change the ending for Paul. And we've talked about that. And believe it or not, in this new book, we are going to address the Paul Castellano, John Gotti thing. And I'm going to address it in a way you guys are not going to believe, because there is a lot there. And I don't know if you guys know this, but do you know who gave Frank Cali the nod to be boss? John Gotti. That says a lot about John Gotti's thought process. People call Peter Gotti a dummy. Peter Gotti was no dummy. He was a very smart guy. He got caught. But he's the only one that tried to kill Sammy Gravano. He's the only one. That takes some balls. Even though they, got into the Steven Seagal shit, which, whatever. But John Gotti was three-dimensional. And I think because I see John in a different way than most people. They see the sort of lambasting, dressing well, fuck you and your mother FBI sort of deal. But John Gotti was three-dimensional. He was no dummy. He was no dummy. And granted, I think a lot of the reason why that comes up is because of the wiretaps when he's pissed off in prison saying ridiculous shit. He's venting, and he had his hardcore beliefs. But a large part of the book, which is called The Tenets of American Cosa Nostra, Omerta, we are going to really dissect the Paul Castellano hit like you have never heard it before. Because I know things nobody knows about that situation. I have things that nobody has on that. And that's not something I want to do a show on. That's something I want to put in a book. And always when I write a book, just like we do on this show, I try to put you in the room with them. And there's going to be a lot of murders we're going to talk about in that next book. I'm probably going to talk about 5 to 7 murders, and we're going to get really deep with it, show you the planning, the execution, the politics, and the results and the domino effect of that, because it's very important. I always say on this show, sometimes a murder is just a murder, other times it's not. These are men, far and large, who are brilliant. They have brilliant IQs. The problem is they didn't have the foundation or the ability to go to college. They didn't have the ability to do this because of money and whatever else. And that's why these men chose this life. And I'm not making an argument for morality. I'm just telling you how it is. But the one important thing that I learned most that sort of changed for me was I don't know how brilliant Carlo Gambino really was. Because I went through FBI report after FBI report who everybody said Paul Gambino was the real gangster of the two. And that Carlo was just smart, right? And Carlo could be a dangerous guy. but Carlo wasn't a brute. And you got to think about it. Anastasia, Carlo's in a really weird place in history. And I'm not saying Carlo was soft, but a lot of the wealth Carlo attained came because of Paul and his brother, Paul Castellano and Paul Gambino. Paul Gambino was the real fucking deal. And a lot of people said, at least informants and some maid guys said, that between Carlo and his brother Paul, Carlo was a dunce, that Paul was the heavyweight. And maybe for practicality reasons, that's why it makes the most sense as to why Carlo would be in a position to dictate versus on the streets. Because I think when you, when you put Carlo in a room and put him next to Anastasia, who's coming out of that room alive? So now you see where I'm kind of going with that. And I think what truly changed my opinion of Paul, I still think Paul made horrible mistakes. And in the book, we're going to address those mistakes because there's a lot that people don't know about Paul. I think you're going to see that Paul really had backed himself in a corner. And like Gotti would find out, if you're not preemptive when you get that gut feeling, you're going to pay the piper. It happened to Paul, and it happened to Gotti. And there's going to be a real juxtaposition about, did John make the right decision? And there's going to be lots of arguments. There's going to be pros and cons for both sides of that. Would John have risen on his own? Probably not. Do I think that Paul's murder was greenlit? Absolutely. 100%. That's going to be a part of the book too. Because there was a lot of Machiavellian shit that was going on. And for those that are going to disagree with me, let me just simply say this. There is no way John Gotti on his own could go to 3 or 4 captains and have it passed around that they want to hit Paul and that doesn't get back to Paul. Or it doesn't get back to other crime families. And I'm telling you that because the streets are a gossip factory. They always have been. They always fucking will be. That's what tells me. Because there's just no way that didn't filter back to Vinny the Chin or to any of these other guys. It filtered back somehow. Maybe through Frankie DeChico. I'm not sure. I wasn't there. But I think I have a good idea on how this went down. And I'm going to talk about it in the book. And it's the closest you're going to get to being on the scene of a hit. And so I think, at the end of the day, Paul lost sight of who he was. The very thing that kept Paul safe from the 1920s or 1930s to the 1970s is what gets him killed in 85, 84, 81, I can't remember the year, 84, whatever. And that's the thing, is guys don't take an opportunity. It's like this iPhone shit. And I'm going to wrap this up in just a second. Why are you going to text criminal shit on an iPhone? Go meet a guy in the middle of the night at a fucking graveyard. FBI could follow you there, but they don't know what you're talking about. It's laziness that puts guys in prison. And I think a lot of Paul's problem was he was not as hands-on as he should have been. Yes, insulate yourself, be the boss, sit in your house. But the minute that he loses Neil Delacroce, it's over. It's game over for him. It's game over. It's game over. And that's the whole point. So there you have it. The end of the Paul Castellano show. We're going to get out of here. We will be back this Friday with a full Q&A. Thanks for joining in, and we will see everybody next week.